Hello, so today we'll be doing a presentation on Leucine zippers. So to start off, we'll go into a little bit of an overview of what that is. So a Leucine zipper is also known as a DNA binding structural motif. What that means is that it binds to DNA. Now we won't go into too much detail about that, but what we'll focus more on is the dimerized portion right here of alpha helices. No, this is known as a coiled coil. This happens where every seventh residue is a leucine, and the leucine right here will couple together via van der Waals forces. So this is possible because leucine is nonpolar and it is hydrophobic. So being that it's nonpolar, that contributes directly to its van der Waals forces, little tiny forces that within big numbers creates a big stabilization force. And the fact that it's hydrophobic makes that leucine is on the interior of this coil, the core. So it tends to not be on the outside because the outside environment is aqueous, there's water molecules, and it tries to stay away from that. So, additionally, we also kind of want to brush on to the fact that there are electrostatic interactions occurring outside of these alpha helices. And here we see, before we were talking about leucine interacting with each other, but on the outside, an example being lysine and glutamate interacting with each other via the positively charged portion of a lysine and the negatively charged portion of a glutamate. Now, what's the purpose of this? My theory is that it's meant to more tightly bind together these dimers and to keep out molecules from entering into the core of that coiled coil. So we'll jump into the first prompt. Now, we already discussed a little bit about the importance of leucine's properties that make it a good residue on the interior surface of this coil. Now, what would be a good replacement? My thought would be valine. So the reason being that it shares a lot of similar characteristics. For one, it is nonpolar. So valine, as we can see, has methyl groups coming off of this carbon. This one just happens to have an extra carbon on leucine. So they are very similar. In fact, valine might actually be less sterically bulk, but they're both hydrophobic, nonpolar. So this would make a good replacement for leucine that allows it to come together with van der Waals forces, tightly pack, that's really important, and thus stabilize an interior core that keeps this dimer from breaking apart on its own. Now, what would make a bad replacement? One example would be glutamate. So, if we look at glutamate, we see that there is a negative charge on it. So that's one big giveaway of how it's different. Whereas something like leucine, no charges, it's neutral. Glutamate also is hydrophilic as a result of being polar. So what does that mean for us in terms of the interior core? Well, that means that glutamate likes to interact with water. So it will tend to open up that core, thus break apart the dimer. So essentially it defeats the purpose of having a coil. So not very good. Now, another thing I'd like to point out is that it is sterically bulk. As you can see, it's pretty big compared to this. We have a carbonyl, we have an oxygen coming off. It's the carboxylic acid. So it's pretty big. It's unfavorable to have towards the center of this coil. So even if we can get past the fact that it's negative, then it just wouldn't be favorable to have in there. It wouldn't be stable, and it would easily break apart. So before we move on, I also want to point out pKa. So another thing that makes this a bad replacement is that depending on the pH of the environment, this residue, glutamate, would act differently. It would alter its shape. So in the case of being around pH of 7, it would maintain this negative charge. However, if it dropped below 4.1, then it would protonate, become an OH instead of the O minus, and as a result become neutral. So like I was saying before, the negative charge makes it unfavorable on the inside. A neutral charge does make it favorable, but like we had already talked about, steric bulk prevents this from moving forward. So still, there's not really a good way to justify glutamate being a good replacement, because it's not. So moving on. So prompt 2 will focus on electrostatic interactions, which you already kind of went over briefly. So just a little recap. In the case of our leucine zipper, we're looking at lysine and glutamate interacting with each other based on their positive and negative charge. So in this case, lysine being positive, negative for glutamate. And as I had mentioned, my thoughts being that this opposing charge will allow for a stronger dimerization between these two alpha helices, and may also help in preventing molecules from coming in and messing with that interior core. Now, my thoughts are that arginine and aspartate would be a good replacement for lysine and glutamate. How come? Well, arginine is positive, glutamate is negative. So that's one big thing. They're not neutral. So being that they are opposing forces, they would tend to come together and form a connection and come closer. So that is one big reason to justify that. Now, another thing is that they have similar pHs. So arginine's pKs. Arginine's pKa is 12.5, whereas lysine's is 10.8. A little bit different, but in this case, I think it still works. So, in fact, it might even be more resistant to changing its configuration, since environments may be more likely to stay around the pH of 7. Aspartate and glutamate have the same pK of 4.1. So, in general, though, we're looking at the pKs and we're seeing that these molecules or these residues will tend to behave similarly in the same pH environments. Another thing is maybe to consider steric bulk. In this case, you may have a little bit of a difference in steric bulk. So as we can see with lysine compared to arginine, arginine has a little bit more bulkiness to it. Whereas from glutamate to aspartate, there's one less carbon, so it tends to be less bulky. What does this really mean in the end of all this? I don't think it means much in terms of if it'll interact or not. It'll still interact with each other, the arginine and aspartate. However, there's not going to be an issue of whether they'll fit in terms of the space around them, because since they will be situated on the outside, right, on the outside of the alpha helix, there's a lot of space for them to interact. So there's not really a thing to consider steric repulsion. So I think we're good there. So that basically concludes this presentation. Thank you.